I'm going to give you a short description. It is in the bio, and I kind of always feel weird reading what's in the bio, but here we are. Joy Katz is a poet, the author of The Garden Room and Fabulae. She's the co-editor of the acclaimed anthology Dark Horses, Poets on Overlooked Poems, and I know that she's very interested in avant-garde as well, avant-garde aesthetics and poetry, so you can ask her questions about that as well. Her new book, All You Do Is Perceive, which is due out when? Which month? Next year, 2012.
2013.
2013, was a finalist in the National Poetry Series, and it's coming out with 4-way books. She teaches graduate writing programs in the graduate writing programs at the University of Pittsburgh and at Chatham College, and she's the editor-at-large for Pleiades. And Ethelbert Miller is a literary activist, and he's based in Washington, D.C. He's the editor of Poet Lore, which is the oldest continuously published journal in America. When was it started? 1889. And he hasn't been with them that long. He's been with them since 1990, what?
Last 10 years.
The last 10 years. You do the math. Okay. Since 1974, he served as director of the African American Resource Center at Howard University. And he's written several books of poetry, including things, I love these names, Where Are the Love Poems for Dictators, and How We Sleep on the Nights We Don't Make Love. He has written creative nonfiction as well, Fathering Words, The Making of an African American Writer, and The Fifth Inning. And he's a visiting Fulbright specialist with us right now. So we are going to now have a discussion. They're going to do a reading at 6 o'clock. So stay with us, and we're going to move down. I'm going to cross dramatically in front of them and sit down, and then we're all going to have a panel discussion. You can have some Q&A afterwards, so save your questions, or maybe just even...
I imagine that people might have questions as we're talking.
As you're talking. If you have a question while you're talking, make yourself known, okay?
I think I'll start with something in terms of when you did my introduction, and I think it might give us some insight in terms of poetry. As you can see in my bio, one of the titles is Where Are the Love Poems for Dictators, and that came out in 1986, and then reprinted again in 2001. What was very interesting is that a poet by the name of Brian Gilmore, who lives in Michigan, was familiar with this collection, and he immediately went to the title poem of this collection after the incidents in Libya with the removal of Gaddafi. It was an opportunity to see how poems survive through particular periods. Where I was writing about dictatorships in Central and South America, here was a poem that held up over a span of time. And I think it was because of the issue in terms of the title, Where the Love Poems for Dictators. When I wrote that poem, there was no punctuation. It was not a question at the end of that. I was leaving it like, okay, who would write a love poem for a dictator, other than the dictator? And that got into a whole thing in terms of punctuation, conveying an idea, political idea, craft, because I didn't want to have somebody think, well, Ethelbert, where's a question mark? But I did include the question mark in the title, but when I was writing, conceiving it, I was thinking of that it would be a question that one would not even want to pose. But I just use that in terms of when you introduce me. Titles are very important for me in terms of books. I think this has a lot to do with the marketing, in terms of that sometimes what a reader might be connected to. You could think about the remaining bookstores that were left, but you could think about when was the last time you walked into like a bookstore, went directly to the poetry section and selected a book of poems by someone you didn't know. Okay? That doesn't happen all the time for those of us who are poetry lovers. But those of us who are poetry lovers who do go to the store, go to the poetry collection, sometimes it's the title of a poem that sort of resonates with us, the title of a collection, and we pick it up. That has a lot to do with the marketing. I think that one of my strengths as literary activists is looking at how one markets, especially in our changing society, and that comes with issues of politics, race and gender.
Well, it was really hard to find a title for this new book of mine that's coming out, and it's finally called All You Do Is Perceive. And actually, the publisher of my book really hates this title. They think it's aggressive and mean. It's not meant that way at all.
I voted for Where's Bar-Ilan?
Oh, okay. Put the question to some of my poet colleagues in the world and said, which title would you choose? And I had about 4. And Marcella voted for a different one, but so, I mean, I don't mean it to be aggressive at all. It's a question. It's sort of an accusation I level at myself. You know, your problem is all you do is perceive. You know, that's what poetry does. I mean, and I hope in the end that the book refutes that. And you know, it's more than simply perception. But I feel like perception is a big part of how I live. Just seeing. Just regarding. And I think that regarding, I think it's many things. I think it's a form of love. I have some sort of love poems about my young son where I just only want to look at him. I don't want to speak with him or really even interact with him, but I feel so powerfully that I just want to only see him. And it's a very peculiar kind of trancy, almost trippy state of being. It happened a lot when he was a small baby, so there are a lot of poems about that. But yeah, it was a hard book to title. But I think that in the U.S. anyway, most people, mostly it's poets who buy other poets' books, and mostly people wouldn't see a book on a shelf and think, I've never heard of this, I'm just going to seize on this and buy it. I think that happens hardly ever. I think people would buy it because if they know my work, they would think, oh, well, here's that book Joy's been talking about, or maybe I heard something about it. Here's that book. But I don't know, maybe if the title seems mean and aggressive, maybe that would be provocative, so that might be okay, but yeah.
I just noticed when I was talking to you both and putting this together in your bios, you have a lot of interlapping issues, interests, and activities. And I was part of the idea of perception, marketing, and the role of poetry in the world. I was sort of wondering, you both are editing pretty predominant journals or important journals, and I was wondering what the interaction is between, or maybe the role of literary journals and small press in defining or creating our literary aesthetic or our literary, what would you call it, our literary taste in a particular era. Do you think it defines it more or it establishes it? What do you see happening with your own journals? Maybe you could tell a little bit about poet lore and deities.
Well, people know me that for many years I didn't like Poet Lore magazine at all. I stayed away from it. It didn't appeal to me. The work didn't appeal to me. So I just avoided it. The Poet Lore magazine comes out of the Writers Center. For many years, when I was a member of the DC Arts Commission in Washington, and the Writers Center was in Maryland, I was always cutting off the money, because I said, well, we're not going to fund anything in Maryland. We're going to cut it off in the district. No money for Poet Lore magazine. But then I'm also on the board of the Writers Center, and so in this case, I have to look at the magazine as an outgrowth of a center. I've been trying to get the Writers Center to see itself as a national literary center, with the magazine being the front of it. It's a battle with the board because many people on the board don't read the magazine, and so it's constantly a battle with the board members. Okay, just get behind this. This is wonderful. This will promote the center. And they still don't get it. It's at university, for example, where the board consists of corporate people. They don't read or do anything with the arts. So that's an ongoing issue. But I tell you one of the things which I did when I became one of the editors, 10 years ago, I really changed the physical look of the journal. Okay, since it was the oldest journal, I wanted to make sure that every issue had a historical look. So we started using photographs from the Library of Congress. We started looking for photographs around events that took place around 1889. So that was one of the first looks. On the back of the early issues of Poet Lore magazine, contributors' names were not listed. I felt for many writers who were new, to see their names next to well-known writers, I think it has a lot to do with that self-confidence and esteem. That was very important. Then I did something that I would always encourage you. When you have the mic, use it, okay? I created a magazine based on the type of work I like, okay? So somebody said, whoa, okay, what's it? I like the poems that I like. That's my thing. My magazine, my poems, okay? Now my co-editor is Jody Bowles. Jody has a different aesthetic. We do have what's called the passion rule. That's like that's how you overrule Clarence Thomas or Scalia. What happens is that if you feel very passionate about a poem, it gets into publication. We don't use it that much. Jody and I, it's fascinating how two editors after a while can come to some sense of agreement, okay? But what I'm also looking at is the fact that Polar only comes out twice a year, okay? I want to make sure during those two issues that if you're a subscriber, you're looking forward to the next issue. You don't want to have a magazine that every issue sounds the same. You also want to have a magazine that you want to feel, okay, I can read this magazine and I can send work to it, okay, and have a chance. Even though it's my magazine, in my view, I try to be very, very open and many times publish work that perhaps is a leap, okay? We also have a section that we have called Poets Introducing Poets. It's one way of getting those, that masthead of contributed editors who do nothing, okay, it's getting them involved in the journal. In such a way that we ask them to pick a person that they like. This way what happens is that we put aside like maybe space for a writer to have like maybe 10 to 15 poems. That's almost like a little chapbook, okay? And by having contributors who are placed around the country, we know now that we can give our magazine a national look, okay? The next person who's going to be a guest poet is Marilyn Chin, who has a little perfume poem. She's out in California. And hopefully, she will bring something new to our journal. And that's a way of getting past just Jody and myself and keeping the magazine fresh, like vegetables and fish. You want it fresh. Any magazine that's still, I don't pick up. I don't even want to sniff it.
That's a good question. How many submissions do you get per issue that's going to come out, and what are your criteria in selecting the poems that you do select?
Yeah, that's like a trick question. When I accepted this job 10 years ago, I didn't know what I was getting into. I remember when the first packets came, there were like 3 packets, about maybe 20 manuscripts for the contributors in. I didn't get through that in a month. Then they kept coming like every 2 months, maybe every 2 weeks, So, we go through almost like about 1,000 poems, and we only come out like twice a year. Now, out of like maybe a stack of 6 packets, I may find 3 poems, okay, that I like, okay. For a poem to get in, Jody has to like it also. So we have to have that match, or, we convince each other. We read each poem aloud, to hear it. Sometimes Jody's a very good editor. We take pride in sometimes corresponding with a contributor. Sometimes Jody will help somebody get the poem in. And I think that's what is missing now. In terms of, with the old-fashioned type, where you would have this correspondence and dialogue with the editor. I think that's very important. I like to feel that the magazine represents American poetry, okay? And this is what I didn't see with many other journals. In fact, Dan Bernano, who edits the American Poetry APR, every time we see them we laugh, because at one time that magazine was attacked by people of color. It was the American Poetry Review, and they never published any people of color. And so those are the challenges, I think, of editors, especially in 2012, to be open, to not be overwhelmed by the amount of material that comes in, but say, okay, this is service to the field. I should enjoy doing the editing, and I think it makes me a better writer.
Well, Pleiades has a lot of the same philosophies and practices that Poet Laureate does. We also have an editor's introduction feature where we either have contributing editors, or I have introduced new writers in the magazine, and that's such a pleasure to find someone who hasn't published very much at all and say, here's a new voice, and here's what I find in this voice that's so exciting. And I think that's a great service to the field too. Just a note on, I don't know if are there people here who are just starting to submit their work? And at least one, okay, some hands, some hesitant hands. I think it's really important to submit work. But I also think it's, if you possibly can, to correspond with an editor and to read the magazine. That really makes a huge difference. I think if you find a magazine and there are poems you like in the magazine, to be able to talk to the editor about the magazine, show that you've read it, and say, hey, I really like these poems by, you know, D.A. Powell or Marcella Schulock, or, you know, something you've seen in the magazine that you like, and here is some of my new work. I think that, I don't know, we don't really get too much correspondence other than submissions in the slush pile. So when there is a piece of correspondence, or if you find a magazine that you like, to subscribe to it, because supporting literary magazines is part of your job, part of all of our job, not just you, but it's part of my job in the world, in the literary world. Yeah, question.
I thought of this when you were talking about making this America, and I thought I just read an interview with Carl Hall, a narrative, which is an online journal. What do you think of online poetry journals?
They're great. I mean, I think like print literary journals, there's a range. There are some wonderful journals online, and then there are some not as wonderful journals online. You just have to kind of read around to find what you like. What do you think?
Well, what we've been doing, this has been my strong philosophy, and I think Jody's buying into it. Because we're the oldest poetry magazine, we want to uphold that. We want to represent tradition. That's why on the latest couple you see an excerpt of Whitman's notebooks and the ad that Whitman ran. What we can see is the future coming. You know, online magazines. Even right now, Jody and I take a few poems that are submitted online. We don't say, at least, we ask. We really haven't developed a website at the Writers Center, which the Poet Law comes under, where we provide some sort of new feature that would lead a person from the website maybe to the actual journal. But what I feel is that there are going to be people who always want the ballpoint, the pen, and the quill and things of that. So that's not going to go away. Same way, like right now, there's still some people like, give me the old stereo and the vinyl. And I feel that over the years, this might be what Poet Law's contribution might be. We represent one of those old journals, okay, and keeping that tradition alive. That's not to say we're against, the automobile, but we realize that there was a nice thing in terms of the horse and buggy. And that's just a thing, understanding progress and tradition. And I think what happens is that, I'm a good example of this because I don't even know how to drive. And I'm editing the magazine. So I guess I was a type of person who come back in 1889. I was a free person of color.
Yeah.
How would you define the sort of the old standard of poetry journal? You mean physically, like getting the submissions by mail and returning the answer in a self-addressed stamped envelope, or is it?
Well, to me, old means edited by men, edited by white men. I mean, seriously. Very few women on staff.
Positive values, you're referring to traditional.
When you said that, I would think of the joke by Mary Barack, who used to be Leroy Jones. When he was in the Air Force station in Puerto Rico, he was reading a copy of Poetry magazine, and he was on his bench in Puerto Rico, and he started to cry and weep and everything. And he said, I was weeping because I knew I could never write like this, nor did I want to. And that's one of the challenges. But I think that, what you just said is a very important question because, we're looking at the various outlets. We want to be accessible. I think that when the mail was coming in, it was a slow process. I think we're overwhelmed right now. We also are a magazine that we don't have the infrastructure. We also have been suffered from the changes of staff. Like Jody and I have been the major editors, but the managing editor who really puts the stuff in order. That's a key position. And this is why I'm a strong supporter of like the endowment, where publications can go and get financial assistance so that they can shore up the infrastructure to be able to pay a managing editor money that might keep that person at least in a position for 3 to 4 years. And that's why I think a lot of magazines fall or don't promote themselves well, because they don't have anybody that's doing it full time. A lot of us just do it because we love doing it. But for some of the other positions, they need to be paid staff positions, and we just can't afford to do it. The same way I remember when the endowment was big in terms of making sure people were paid for their work. It would be nice if we could pay poets not just complimentary copy of the journal, but at least some sort of token, fee, which I think has a lot to do in terms of just the worth of your work.
Yes.
I mean, this is a more general question, but I mean, like, do you think that, like poetry as a whole, I mean, like, can become more successful if you would encourage the type of writing that's on a simpler level, more appealing to the masses?
No. No, well, I think you have to find what it is that you really want to write. And I know my students talk about this a lot. There's something they talk about called accessibility. And I have quotation marks around it because what's accessible to me or accessible to this woman may or may not be accessible to you. And that accessible sometimes in my classes at my university, it's sort of a shorthand for white middle class kind of, U.S. writing, and so I try to always make my students aware that when you say that, you may not have intended to, you may not know that, but here's what it might mean. And so, but there are magazines, there's so many magazines, and I think that a magazine like Pleiades is a magazine, it has a pretty wide bandwidth. So Pleiades will print something more innovative, restless, avant-garde. It'll also print something extremely, using received form and rhyme and meter. It will print a narrative poem, a lyric poem. So, but then there are poems that have a narrow bandwidth. By bandwidth, I mean, if you pick up the magazine, you think, I'm going to find this kind of poetry in it. And there are magazines like, for instance, Fence. There's one called Fence, where you're going to find really only innovative writing. But, even within that, there's a lot going on. But so it just depends from magazine to magazine on the editor's vision. And I think it's all good. So you have to sort of find your tribe. And then when a magazine really supports you, being loyal to that magazine and trying to publish there more is a great thing. It kind of, I don't want to use the word brand because it sounds so crass and commercial, but that helps.
Yeah, I think also, because it is poetry, I think we have to also, as editors, be advocates for the difficult poem. And people have addressed this, poems that make you work, poems that make you use your muscles, I think that's why I think poetry is very important, because right now in our society, so everything seems to be moving very, very fast, the poetry, slows you down. I mean, you can't read like you read journalism. And the poems sometimes force you to go back and look words up, makes you work and you interact. And so I think that's key. One of the other things that we did at Poet Row, which I think is important, and we promoted this in terms of the magazine, is that is being advocates also for the long poem. I saw, for example, many of my friends were writing long poems, and there was no place to place those poems. And even for us at Poet Row, it means a real commitment, because we only come out twice a year. It's like saying, okay, we're going to give this one person this space. But then, if, for example, 6 or 7 years go by, we were the magazine that gave that writer that space, and that writer becomes extremely important, and that's part of the tradition of our magazine, then I think we're doing something that's very important. I think the long poem, the difficult poem, all this comes back in terms of trying to be an editor in which you're open. And I bring this whole thing in terms of being an American editor, being an American poet, I think makes me concerned about issues of democracy. And that's when it gets into issues of race and women and things like that. That's what we do. I think that if we're going to be the children of Whitman, then we are the children also of democracy.
That was a good question, because it's a wonderful way to jump into many different kinds of issues also. I mean, it's a good question by itself. It's a good question for us, because there were many things that you guys wanted to talk about that I thought would be interesting for you all. And this is a good way to do it. Joy's answer about accessibility, which is probably what you meant when you use user-friendlier. There are many trends in writing. There are many trends in fiction too. You just don't, you're not as aware of them. With poetry, there has been, in the 80s and 90s, people wrote confessional poems. Poems in which the I was meant to be the speaker, the biological poet that sat down and wrote. You had then experimental avant-garde poems, language poetry, in which there was no one narrative, and you were just experimenting with language and playing with language for the sake of language. The same thing happens with painting and music as well. The same thing happens in fiction. But this question of accessibility and the idea of race and gender and the dominant narrative is an interesting one. And we were talking about this a little bit last night, and it's come up in the poetry world among our colleagues. There is a writer named Tony Hoagland who inadvertently set off the whole thing with another poet named Claudia Rankine. And this is his book, What Narcissism Means to Me. And there's one poem in here that sort of set the stage, and I hope that you guys don't mind that we're framing this narrative through Tony Hoagland, or this discussion through Tony Hoagland, but it sort of came up because we were talking about it, and Ethelbert said, "Oh, you mean the Tony Hoagland, Claudia Rankine thing?" So let's just put it out there. Here's the poem. It's called Change. The season turned like the page of a glossy fashion magazine. In the park, the daffodils came up, and in the parking lot, the new car models were on parade. Sometimes I think that nothing really changes. The young girls show the latest crop of tummies. The new president proves that he's a dummy. But remember the tennis match we watched that year? Right before our eyes, some tough little European blonde pitted against that big black girl from Alabama. Cornrowed hair and Zula bangles on her arms, some outrageous name like Rondella Aphrodite. We were just walking past the lounge and got sucked in by the screen above the bar, and pretty soon we started to care about who won. Putting ourselves into each whacked return as the volleys went back and forth and back, like some contest between the old world and the new. And you loved her complicated hair and her to hell with everybody stare. And I couldn't help wanting the white girl to come out on top. Because she was one of my kind, my tribe, with her pale eyes and thin lips, and because the black girl was so big and so black, so unintimidated, hitting the ball like she was driving the Emancipation Proclamation down Abraham Lincoln's throat, like she wasn't asking anyone's permission. There are moments when history passes you so close you can smell its breath. You can reach your hand out and touch it on its flank. And I don't watch all that much masterpiece theater, but I can feel the end of an era there, in front of those bleachers full of people in their Sunday tennis watching clothes, as that black girl wore down her opponent, then kicked her ass good, then thumped her once more for good measure, and stood up on the red clay court, holding her racket over her head like a guitar. And the little pink judge had to climb up on a box to put the ribbon on her neck, still managing to smile into the camera flash, even though everything was changing, and in fact, everything had already changed. Poof. Remember? It was the 20th century, almost gone. We were there. And when we went to put it back where it belonged, it was past us, and we were changed. This made Claudia Rankine, a woman poet of color, rather uncomfortable, this poem. And it began a big debate, which was...
Yeah, I think that, I don't remember, I thought that it was a very good poem.
Yeah.
And I thought it was Tony Hoagland doing something that many white writers don't do, and that's write about race. The question, I don't know whether it was ever posed to Claudia, whether she was a tennis fan or not. Which is very important, because when you go back and, well, let's just bring in Serena Venus' father in the stands. When these sisters came on the court, they were kicking people's butts. And they were playing a very masculine, muscular game. It was I mean, that's how they played. It wasn't, you know, they were hitting the ball, you know. And what happened, it was a whole thing in terms of like they had come into this private space, and they were bringing their game. Now, I think Chloe probably responded as a black woman in terms of how, you know, the women are being depicted in Tony's poem. I think that's that first read. You see, that's that first read. And I wasn't in that audience, but well, are you a tennis fan? Did you know what was happening in tennis? That's like me writing, that's like Tony Hoagland writing a poem about Jackie Robinson. And somebody said, well, you know, here I used on the language. Yeah, well, Jackie Robinson was going through that. And what happened, it did get down to, look, I started rooting for the Williamsons. I don't even understand tennis. I just knew they were winning, you know. And that was what was played out. The family were sometimes getting into physical altercations. You know, we accept the Venus and Serena because they've been winning. But you go back to those their early matches, and what was not covered, how the family was treated. Okay, and I think what Tony did was take it to this next level. I think Gloria read it, and as a black one, I respect that. You know, this looks like this is a stereotype thing. That's what. But Tony is being honest in terms he goes by and says, "Yeah, I'm rooting for the white girl." And sometimes what happens is that it gets down the race. Now, let's just look at this recent thing. I'm not even a hockey fan. The Capitals beat the Boston, and a black guy won the black guy. I don't even know the guy's name. The black guy scored the winning puck in the seventh game. I go past the newspaper, and it looked as if these white guys who were on his team were getting, the brother was like this. It's like, he looked like he was being lynched, you know. But he won the game. But what am I saying? The racism from the Boston fans, you know, that all of a sudden they got wiped, they kicked out of the playoffs. And this black guy, how many black, he's the only black guy on either team, you know. And this is how race in hockey, that's just recently, okay? Tony Hoagland is like a witness and being honest with what he sees. And he says, yes, okay, I'm cheering for that white. He's not being, he's putting himself in the poem. And I think that's real. I think Chloe Rankin is maybe, you know, maybe she's got braids too and felt very personal about it. I don't know. But what happened, I think she does have braids. Yeah, it's a personal thing. What happens is that, you know, I see she read it as a black woman and got off, but to take it to where it got, you know. And Tony Hoagland isn't a writer in which, you know, his work has not been progressive and things of that sort. I'll defend Tony Hoagland on this. Dwayne Betts, another writer, okay? Dwayne Betts was in prison in Virginia for 8 years for carjacking. During the entire time that he was in jail, he wrote to so many people, sent poems out. Only 2 people responded to Dwayne Betts. Myself, my publisher reporter, and Tony Hoagland. Was the only 2 people, okay? And Tony Hoagland took the time to write this guy who didn't even know who was incarcerated, okay? And that's the type of writer, the type of individual he is. I know a lot of people might talk about incarceration. Tony Hoagland took the time, and he changed a person's life. Where's Dwayne Betts now? Dwayne Betts 2 weeks ago was appointed by President Obama for a position dealing with juvenile detention and stuff. But what I'm saying is that Tony Hoagland affected Dwayne Betts. You know, when Tony Hoagland came to read it at the Folger, Dwayne was right down there at the Folger Library to meet this guy who took the time to write to him while he was incarcerated. Okay? So I would hate for somebody to say, oh, Tony Hoagland's a racist or something like that, because what happens, you know, one little incident or literary discussion, you know, and this is the beauty of poetry. You can have different discussions around it. And so in that case, that's a contribution. Now, if it gets into the whole thing where everybody's going to play the dozens and talk about people's mothers and stuff like that, then that's not the MLA.
I think one of the things that's interesting about this poem and about other of Tony's poems is that he inhabits whiteness. I mean, he's found a way for himself to write whiteness cognizantly. And I think that there have been very few white writers who have done it, I think, by his, you know, and suddenly it becomes necessary. This is something that he, you know, is concerned about and concerned with. And I think when you're an old white guy, as Tony is, writing your whiteness and super masculine, is that what you're saying? I think that writing that and inhabiting that is really difficult. And I think that he takes risks in this book and in other of his poems. I think it's very, very interesting what he's doing. And on one hand, you could say, ha, it's really, so Joy Katz is sitting up here saying, oh, it's really difficult to be an old white poet, as, in one way, of course, it's not. I mean, like I said a minute ago, David in charge of the literary magazine scene, forever and ever and ever, not so much anymore. Still by and large, yes, but not as much. Anyway, I'm currently trying to find a way myself to write in my whiteness cognizantly and have that be the subject of some of my poems and essays. And I have to invent a way for myself to do it because there sure aren't many models. So Tony Hoagland is someone I look at who has done that. Interesting. Yeah.
Where's the Jewish voice fit in race and gender issues?
Definitely, you mean for me or in general?
But I guess both, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, in my life, being Jewish, I have been the other because I grew up in a Polish Catholic neighborhood of a working class city. So I was one of the very, very few Jewish children at my school. So I grew up as a Jew almost entirely among non-Jews. So that was my otherness. I now have a young child of a different race. So he, and I don't want to raise him plus which he's also Jewish. So it gets sort of getting more and more complicated. So I don't want to raise him white. So I'm trying to find a way to write is really one of the ways I'm trying to find a way to think and to live. I'm never going to be anything but white, but I want to be very, very aware of that. I'm very aware of it all the time now in a way that I haven't been. But I don't want to just talk about myself, so.
Yes, this poem that you just read, it's interesting that nobody called it just honesty. And that is what made it upset other people, because you look at yourself, do I think like this also? And it upsets you to find that you yourself are prejudiced.
Yeah,
that is what I felt.
And that's, I think it's astounding that that's in the poem.
Is he honest that I felt this way, and it is wrong or it's right, and that's left up to you?
Yes, that's the amazing thing. It's left up to you. He inhabits this uncomfortable moment. He never announces in the poem, this is uncomfortable. And it clearly has made people uncomfortable. But I think that's a boon of this poem, is its discomfort.
It's the writer's job to make you look into yourself.
I think so too. But anyway, I'll stop there.
I wonder, related to that in terms of the writing, how does dialect and slang work in? Because I recall reading, a friend of mine who now lives in England, gave me a book by Derek Walcott. And Derek Walcott does a beautiful job of doing rhymes in West Indian, in the dialect of the West Indian. You can feel the West Indian English in the books, even in a long novel about the Arkansas, when he went through Arkansas. And I still remember that. That's a very powerful, long poem. To what extent dialect and slang, all these things that are not standard English.
Yeah, I think that Derek Walker is phenomenal and he's been honored. I think the person who's been overshadowed but does a better job is probably Edward Brathwaite from Barbados, who's at NYU. I think he really captures the dialect more. So I think Derek Walcott probably came through Robert Lowell and got to the dialect. But I think that that's one of the most difficult things, especially African American writers right now, in terms of capturing that voice and dialect. I think what happens right now, we have a tremendous generation of extremely talented African American writers who just happen to be very middle class, And I think that what happens, African American writers right now would probably be safe to maybe use Sterling Brown as the model because Sterling Brown wrote completely different from, say, Paul Laurence Dunbar, where the whole thing is that you use the language to convey what you want to convey. You develop that ear and sound, but you really become careful in terms of how you're actually spelling words. You're not forcing it. I'm really concerned now in terms of what certain dialect looks on the page, primarily because we can see how our language has been fractured over the last several years just in terms of spelling. And so what happens, I would be very interested to see, do a case study of writers using dialect and trying to capture the sound. I would probably put in a certain section by himself, Thomas Sayers Ellis, who writes a lot in terms of go-go. I think that Tom really captures the DC voice that I wouldn't even attempt to capture. And he captures that in terms of sound. I can hear that in terms of the musicality. It's very, very difficult. And then what you were saying, you're almost asking an African-American writer to try to be, quote, authentic, as if there's some typical black voice, which there really isn't. And that's the other thing that we have to ask ourselves in terms of, okay, I can hear Derek Walcott and I can sound like this. The best person, I'll end on this, is my friend Ethelbert who did a fantastic essay which he says, we never confuse jazz musicians. Like, I would never confuse Lester Young with John Coltrane, but we want all our writers to sound alike. You see? And I think that's a very profound statement.
So the poet John Berryman wrote this book, which you might have read, called 77 Dream Songs. And in these poems, he shifts diction. Well, at first, I just want to say that's a great question. And I read a lot, I judge a lot for prizes, and I'm a screener. And whenever there's a shift in diction in manuscript, whenever there's some dialect, it always jumps out at me because it happens so seldom. And I think it can make a poetry really rich if you either have access to it or create access for yourself to it. So anyway, the poet John Berryman, back in 1963, is that when the Dream Song came out? Anyway, so one of the so he has these various characters in this book, and one of them is an unnamed black friend who refers to this Henry character as Mr. Bones. And in this book, so John Berryman inhabits this voice of black minstrelsy. And it's been really, it was really controversial, and people, it makes people really angry and upset. But if you look at what that voice is doing in the poems, I just think it's fascinating, and I think that it's really complicated what's going on with that voice in the poems. But the fact that he used it was astonishing, and on most days I think it's brilliant. And some days I think, how could he possibly have done that? It's so completely unethical. But so I shift back and forth, but I'm very, very interested in it. And I would like to do something like that myself, and something I'm working on right now. I haven't figured out a way to do it, but I think it's important. I wish there was more of it.
Yeah. How about using several languages in one poem? Considering myself a trilingual person, I often want to write in several languages and express different voices through these languages. And I was wondering if this is even publishable.
Oh, it is.
I think we all have something to say on that one. Some of my poems are multilingual, and I think the important thing, though, is that if you're doing it in such a way that there's context in the poem, so that you're not doing it to show off, like, look at all the things I can do, but you're doing it because you need that line in that particular language. You can't express it in another way. At the same time, there needs to be enough context in the poem so that you can get what that expression probably is about, if not exactly what it says. Sometimes you can couch it in, I've seen this before in some Yiddish writers, actually, writers who are bilingual with Yiddish. They'll say it in Yiddish and then the comma and repeat it in English, leading it into something else. It can be, there's, Deborah Bernhardt has done it in one of her very in an avant-garde book, and she did Kaddish in her work, and she said it she had lines in Hebrew, spelled in English, and then she would interject other speech, and then they would flip-flop so that the lines that were in Hebrew at the top of the page are now in English at the bottom of the page on the next side. So you have to have some kind of key somewhere so that you can get that. So people that do that, then I would say, well, there are probably a lot of people that do that, but those come to mind. I've just translated a book from Congo, from Zaire, in which it was written in French, but there was native language, there was dialect inside. That just wasn't translated. It wasn't written in French, and I had no idea what it was. And so I talked to the poet about it, and what we ended up doing was putting it in an appendix. But when we originally published those poems, we left it as is. You could get it from the context. You knew that it was happy, joyful song. It was the chorus, the Greek chorus game line, so to speak. And so you knew what it was about. You didn't know what they were saying. And it was an interesting pose, because it sort of made you enter the poem, it made you enter the world of the poem, and you felt like you were a visitor there who understood most of the stuff, but not everything. So I'd say if you're going to do it, you need to also have a reason that you're doing it. It needs to make sense in the world of the poem. Yeah.
Yes, so definitely do it. Do it. Yeah, but there's a whole range of examples from, I'm thinking of Junot Diaz, his stories. So there are lines that are just in Spanish, and you can't, I mean, even if you know a little bit of Spanish, it's not really obvious, or maybe they're even in slang. But he doesn't, they're not only are they not translated, they're also not italicized. So you, the reader, pass in and out of Spanish, but within the rule, like as long as the rules of your poem are clear and steady, or your story, and it works, I think you can do it. And if you're really, really worried, you can have a key at the end. But I think there's kind of you have to strike a balance between, I don't know, I hate the word patronizing. You don't want to sort of patronize the reader, or you don't want to constantly interrupt your story with parentheses. So maybe you can, if it's transliterated, if it's a different alphabet, like Arabic, and the story is otherwise in English, then I suppose it would have to be transliterated. Otherwise, there'd be all these symbols. Although I can also imagine that working. You could make that work too. But, yes.
Before there was Junot Diaz, growing up in New York, it was essential because you were New Rican. You weren't Puerto Rican, you were New Rican. And so when you look back at Miguel Alderin, Pedro Petri, Felipe Luciano, it's New Rican, Spanglish. And so what happens is that, you're on an IRT and you hear somebody talking Spanish, then it's English, then it's right back, okay? And that's how people talk, If you're going to write and be of this community, that's what you're going to bring to the page. And what happens is that certain words, you don't need the translation, but most of you know. And this is a thing that I think when you look at the cultural voice of how people begin to speak for a community before they take it to the page. This is how we communicate, words come in to our vocabulary. I mean, it's interesting to see now in the United States, for example, coming after Spanish, how many Arabic words have now moved in through journalism and picked up. And so all of a sudden you have the word salat, which is just it. I think this follows our eating habits. We were eating tacos and enchiladas, and now there's falafel. I don't know what's next. But that's the thing in terms of if you're a writer, the same way you have to be able to taste these different foods, you're going to have to taste the languages. And all of a sudden, because we are creative and we use our language, we as writers, we represent the future, and we begin to see the change by how these words come into our vocabulary. I maintain that if you want to change the narrative or write the new American narrative, you have to change the vocabulary. And the vocabulary is going to be pieces of this community, Korean and Vietnamese. Yes, that's what it is. And somebody say, well, this looks like the opening scene of Blade Runner. Like some sort of gibberish. Yeah. Well, for somebody in England, Americans are still speaking that. That's not English. That's American. And what happens is that we have to fight for that. If you talk about a new Whitman coming in, he might be speaking Spanglish, or something else. The leaders of class, whatever.
There's a hand there.
Yeah, I was going to tell a story. As far as like post-formalism goes, first of all, I think that this community, what the conversation we're having right here, as far as colloquialisms and certain bits and pieces of Arabic vernacular coming to the mainstream English journalism, because so much of the culture is sui generis, yada yada. I had a professor one time in a poetry class who knocked down my poems and rejected them because they were written in a post-formalist a postmodern, you know, like as if I was taking this. Maybe I guess I was being told in an underhanded way that I was taking post-formalism for granted, whereas I was writing it in maybe a particular poem was written in what used to be called Ebonics in the 1990s. Certain, you know, maybe American urban street vernacular, and it was also inspired by rhythms of jazz music. And the teachers, and then the professors, and this it happened here in Israel, and then the professor told me, oh, that's not actually English.
They say they're back.
I said that's funny. You probably don't even speak, you know, Hebrew. You know, you're lucky to teach English in Israel.
Good for you.
Yes.
Good for you.
I think I saw another hand. Yeah.
Coming into it, about Ebonics, my primary education was an English teacher, and we are always told that Ebonics is not English because you can either see it as broken, badly spoken English, or you can see it as a new language. I mean, English isn't Latin. It's moved on from there, even though French isn't Latin, even though it started off as Latin. So can Ebonics really be viewed as English?
Yeah, that's an old. I mean, what one would probably do, you'd probably go back if you want to see the defense of it. I guess probably the strongest advocate is probably June Jordan first, Colin Rogers second, and these are individuals who are battling. What you also find is that you cannot discuss that issue without power dynamics within society. You know, I mean, that's a key thing there. Also, if you go back, and I use just June Jordan as an example, there's just no way you can explain what she's doing on the page unless you have a theoretical framework in terms of Ebonics. She was very much a strong advocate of it. And, you know, when we say, okay, she's coming out of Brooklyn and Harlem and she's seeing exactly what is the voice that she wants to capture. So it's not as if, you know, she's doing something that's unusual. Whether it's going to be accepted, whether now, if, for example, we're running a school system and we say, okay, we're going to bring in bonds to help people learn and things of that sort, that can become a little more problematic because now we're talking about educational policy. And I think the first group of people that you'll probably find not supporting bonds will probably be the black middle class. You know, who's figuring, okay, I'm turning my son and daughter over to a school system, I'm trying to get them away from Ebonics. Okay, or for example, you go and you're now interfacing with the 1%. I think you don't have a problem with Ebonics.
But one question, I think that we can go back to, say, another major language and maybe draw a comparison. I know in French, in Quebec, they make a thing about joie. In France, you speak Southern French. And you go to Paris, and I've heard, they look at you, what's that? Are we a little bit, are the French every bit as, say, intolerant as English?
Oh, I think there's much French intolerance. Probably everyone's intolerant, right? But I think, you know, the minute you say, I mean, the language is all, or at least in English, you know, and I suspect in every language is shifting and changing and bringing words in. But the minute we start to say, okay, now here's the line between the new words coming in, and on this side of the line is the language being degraded, and on this side of the line is acceptable. I mean, it's really, I wouldn't want to be the person who made the educational policy and said that.
Yeah. I think the one writer who was always protesting the whole French language was probably Leon Demas, who was one of the founders of Negritude. And in his work, he's always battling the French, you know, and in terms of language. And in this case, you know, he's battling colonialism, you know. But if you want to look at a person who in his poems is actually rejecting, you say, like, I want a banjo, you know, he's like playing against the language where his mother is in turn in school people to speak the French, and he's rejecting that. And it's interesting to see that his poetry of the 1930s would be the work that, along with Césaire and Senghor, will lead the foundation for the colonial movement, you know, and independence movement against colonization in the French provinces, in Africa. So you can see the role that writers play. And also, Leon Demas's work has a significant impact on the work of Frantz Fanon, who wrote Wretched of the Earth. So you can begin to see how the language, and the French people, how people were fighting against it, and the poets played a key role in terms of liberating.
As in English.
Right.
It's really interesting because I think what you guys are talking about too, you've noticed a whole trend of language being used as a post-colonial response to a current situation in which, and this is the question of aesthetics that we were talking about earlier, right? What do we mean by accessibility? What do we mean by the accepted language? And all of these challenges, and I think this is what poetry can do very, very well, is that it provides a home, or it provides a place for us to challenge language, accepted language patterns. It provides a place for us to challenge aesthetics and what we mean by accessibility, and it allows this place for us to look at ourselves honestly and look at racist tendencies that we may have, or it opens up dialogue. And this, I think, this is something that Ethelbert keeps talking about when he's talking about literary activism. And I keep wanting to ask him, what exactly do you mean when you talk about literary activism? And this all seems to me to be part of what literary activism is, but I know you mean something else. But yeah.
In terms of literary activism, I'll give you two things which I'm really concerned about. One is preservation. You can go online right now, for example, and access the E. Ethelbert Miller collection, which is at the Gelman Library at George Washington University. It's extremely extensive. People know that I copied J. Edgar Hoover's model, keeping files on all the rights that I know. So it's extremely extensive. And give you an example. If I was a literary scholar, I would take a writer like Julia Alvarez, and I have a lot of letters before we knew how to Garcia accents. But letters when she was out, I think, living in Indiana, and she was really isolated. And you see her through the letters really becoming aware of her cultural identity. And so these documents are extremely important. I'm very much concerned about preservation. I'm very much concerned about even preservation of my own work. So if, for example, any of you are visiting Washington, D.C., you will see my work prominently displayed, outside metro stations, on streets and murals, in restaurants. I'm very much aware of that. All this is lead to enhance the cost of my house after I'm gone. Where, when they say, oh, Ethelbert lived there and his work is at DuPont Circle or whatever. But I'm very much aware of that. I'm very much aware of working with other writers, making sure that they were saving things. I remember, for example, when Rita Dove and Fred, her husband, had a very terrible fire in Charlottesville. What I was able to do is I was able to return to Rita Dove copies of all of her family newsletters that I had been just saving. So not a copy, but the originals. I said, let me turn this back because she had that one. I was saving that type of thing. Preservation. I feel that when you're in any city, it has a literary history. I think if you are raising children, they need to know that history. If, for example, you come to Washington, D.C., you will see throughout the city cultural tourism signs that give you the history. That's an outgrowth of my work. I used to be I was the founder of the Humanities Council. So I'm very much concerned about literary history in every single city so that when you grow up, you know exactly the writer. So, like, for example, when I came to Washington, D.C., Sterling Brown was always called the Poet Laureate of Washington, D.C. He was not, okay? Literary activist, I made Sterling Brown the Poet Laureate of D.C. If you visit D.C., you will see a plaque in front of his house. In terms of issues of gender, it says this is the house of Sterling Brown and his wife Daisy, because Daisy was the inspiration behind a lot of Sterling Brown's work and things like that. So many times wives get overlooked. And so this wasn't just Sterling Brown, this is Sterling Brown and Daisy. So you have to make sure as a literary activist you do this. I work behind the scenes. I try to knock down the doors because, for example, there are certain people who apply. You're not going to get any grants. You're not going to win any awards. Okay? I've made a number of enemies. Is this being recorded? Yes, thanks. I made a number of enemies over the years knocking down doors. Okay? I learned in terms of whenever you're in a room, make sure you speak up for the people who are not in the room. And if you use that as a guiding way of navigating your life, you will do good in the world. Okay? You look around, you see people who are not disabled, or people who speak a certain language, and they're not there, and you really care about your society future, you speak up for them. Okay? And that's being a literary advocate. I've changed the policies of the endowment over the years. I've changed, many of the Lila Wallace Foundation. I can go down the list, okay? In terms of changing the policies in terms of how grants were awarded into who. At one time, if you lived in Alaska, forget it. I remember battling for John Haynes to get get money. Okay, and this is a man who, if you know anything about Alaska, he's as important as Gwendolyn Brooks and Adrian Rich. But sometimes you've got to really be able to be an advocate, and it takes a price. Some people will not like you, because you knocked down some doors and it was painful. But those same people will come back years later and tell you, okay, I remember this one guy, I got to name name. This is issue, I name. My buddy, David Lehman, who's a good friend of mine now. We were on panels, and this sounds like a Tony Hoolan poem. We were on a panel giving out these big grants, right? And I remember we took a break, and the Asian woman said, we've been here all morning, and no people have cut out anything. I said, okay, we'll wait till after lunch. Came back after lunch, I said, well, I can't be the spook who sat by the door. We're going to have to open up the whole process again. And what happened, David Lehman, I didn't know him, right? David Lehman went on. We have a process here and this and that. Now I'm from New York. He went on. And then David Lehman did something that he shouldn't have done. He started a little whining. I knew I had him. He said, oh yeah, we had a process. We can't do this. And then I said, David, you're right. We have a process, but what can I tell you? You're a white man at the end of the century. The rules are going to change, right? Now, fast forward. I'm in the White House on the Laura Bush's book fair. I work with Laura Bush's. And I had recommended David Lehman to be honored by the White House. And I'm sitting in the White House with his mother. And she says, pointing to her son, my son's very smart. I said, yes, I know. Right? And this is years later, right? David comes over to me during the reception. He said, I remember when we first met and how we argued at that meeting about the grants and stuff. And you were so nice to me, afterwards. Of course, I said, David, of course, because you were wrong in the meeting. And we became really good friends. Okay? That's an exception. But we fought. It was hard. We had to kick over. And what did a lot of those people say? They called me up like a week after, okay, when we did all the grants, and they said, Mr. Miller, we're so happy what you did. We're here as program officers, and we can't do it. But we're happy, and you really help us with this process. We want to give more people a call, this and that. And she says to me, do you have any suggestions? I said, you have a suggestion. I think the next time you should just have 7 black judges. If race is not going to be a problem, just have 7 black people and see who gets the money. I didn't hear back from her.
Yeah.
I think it's funny that you mentioned Rita Dove because I wanted to ask, how do you see what she did with that Penguin anthology of 20th century American poetry? I think that's what it was. As literary activism, and like Helen Vendler's response in the New York Review of Books is kind of like the complete opposite of Tony Hoagland's poem, where it's a completely unself-conscious kind of like statement of prejudice and bigotry.
I like Helen Miller very well. I know her and I respect her work. I think what the issue here is not Miller and Rita Dove. I think the issue here is how do you edit a contemporary American anthology? You only have X amount of space. Who are you going to take out? Who are you going to include? And so I think Miller is bringing her take, and that's good. Just like some things you say, okay, some of these anthologies have been edited by white men, so this is why you get more of these beats and opposed to this corn or vegetable or whatever. That's what's going to happen. I think my concern is that it doesn't become the personality conflict, like in the New York Review of Books and things. So it's a basic problem in terms of doing anthologies. That's why if you're the company, the key thing is who you get. I go back and I look at David Lehman, Best American Poetry, that he has guest editors to come in, and so you go from like Adrian Rich to Harold Bloom, and that's a difference. But what happens, this is the politics of doing an anthology. And some people are not going to be included. And some people are going to be left out. And that's where, that's the problem coming in the future. Because it's going to be difficult doing these anthologies and not having the proper representation.
And this is why we need Joy's anthology, the Dark Horses.
Oh, right. I just wanted to underline the fact that when you edit an anthology, you will make enemy. I mean, because it's just a process of leaving out. You know, you only can choose unless you make an anthology that's this thick, and who wants to read that? But I don't think the problem is really the fact of anthologies or the editing of them. I think it's how we regard anthologies. So we should never look at an anthology and regard it as the canon. I mean, this is really someone's vision, or a few people's vision. It's really a record of a moment, and not even of a moment, of one person's moment. And so we just always have to think about them that way, and not perceive them as any kind of, you know.
Well, maybe you did. I think you just provided the good answer, because the issue is it's the Penguin anthology that, you know, you look up is going to be used in many classrooms, and so that's what you just said is important.
Can I ask you about your anthology?
Sure.
Because your anthology is called Dark Horses. It's unoverlooked poems. How overlooked do they have to be? I mean, it seems like a contradictory kind of anthology because they're now in an anthology. Whoops, take him out now. He's been found.
Pretty much all poetry is overlooked, so it's a little bit of a funny title and a funny project, but yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure how to respond.
I didn't mean that as a criticism. I
Oh,
was
no, I
just
didn't-
really
I didn't
interested. I was
say
like,
that.
this is really an interesting concept. So.
Well, some of us got together at a conference one year and had this fantastic conversation at dinner about great poems like that none of the others of us had ever read or heard of. And it turns out everybody has these stories, you know, of, oh my God, I totally missed this person, or this person has barely ever gotten published, or this person's work was suppressed for a long time. And so that's what the anthology ended up being. That was really, yeah, it was really fun to edit. But then, you know, even in an anthology like that of sort of deliberately obscure poets and poems, there were some overlooked Dickinson poems, and then people got upset and said, Dickinson's not overlooked. So, yeah, someone's always mad at you. You just have to get used to it. Oh, yes, two questions. I thought.
I just wanted to say about literary advocacy, that there may be people in the room who are thinking, gee, I'd like to take part in that, you know, but the way you presented it, Ethelbert, it sounds like a difficult one-person road to, you know, seeing things along the way and trying to correct them as you go. And it's really hard, and it's incredible work you've done. And I just was thinking for the people in this audience, if people are interested in taking part in literary advocacy, there are organizations like PEN who are already set up and dealing with things like prison writing or advocating for jailed journalists around the world, that sort of thing. You know, there is a lot of work to be done out there. If you don't want to have to go out and find it yourself, it's waiting.
Right, and I think the work comes down to those things that are very important to us as writers in terms of other institutions that are key. And that's like, for example, public libraries. And so you don't have to be a writer, you can just sometimes be a parent, you know. But if you are a writer, I think it's very important that, you know, you see a city like Camden, New Jersey, or Philadelphia, one of the closer libraries, that you use your writing skill, and you write the op-ed pieces and things of that sort, you write petitions, and that's where you're writing, you write. And that's what I think is very important. Sometimes what happens, it's very important to do op-ed pieces, you know, around certain issues. I'm a strong advocate for funding for the arts, okay? So I'm always concerned about, you know, the amount of money that's being allocated. I'm a strong advocate that writers, for example, should run for public office. I think many times I've talked to many of my friends who are artists, and we're always bemoaning the fact that there's not enough money set aside for the arts. Well, you sit in the budget room and you make those cases, you know. And I look at the fact I'm in the city, in Washington D.C., okay, and I said this publicly in Washington. I don't expect anything from any member in terms of the mayor or the city council. And why? Because when they do a profile of these people's homes, they don't even have art on their walls. You know what I'm saying? You know, they don't even have art. So how are you going to have a discussion? How are you going to, it's just like, for example, it's like, you remember when they used to ask people running for office, you know, like, what's the last book they read, or Sarah Palin couldn't name anything, you know what I mean? You know, yeah, that's why I can go down a list of American writers who you know would probably make better senators. Look at Rahm Emanuel, right? Ron leaves the White House, becomes mayor of Chicago, and what does he say? Chicago is going to be the ballet capital of the world because he likes ballet. You know, so I'm waiting for someone here to say I'm going back to Phoenix. You know, because I love the long home or something. You know, but what I'm saying is that he's mayor, and so you know the ballet is going to get support.
Plaid shirt. Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering, working for U.S.-based magazines, how important is it for you to consider and have international exchanges?
To have what?
International exchanges, even just in English.
Really, really important. Very important. Yes. Are you submitting to U.S. magazines? I mean, I hope so.
Or even if you just listen to most of us who are still English-based, even though we're in Israel, I'm thinking also like England and South Africa, Australia. I've hardly come across that in U.S. publications.
Oh, we're going. I see some people in our magazine. You know what I'm saying is that one of the things I've been doing is going out after writers. And me and Joe were talking. I'm very much concerned about whatever we're doing that we have a sort of global vision. That if we're in New York or D.C. or Philly, we're thinking about other areas where we can have these exchanges. I sat down with one of the editors from Granta magazine, and we talked about doing some joint projects. I think those type of relations are very important. I mean, my next trip is over to London, and whenever I go on a trip, I try to make sure that there's networking. I try to be of service and open in terms of, I see these cultural exchanges. I think, for example, all of us now should have national reputation, international reputations. And if we live in a time of the internet, then we have to edit our magazine with that sort of global vision also.
So leading on from that question, what would be your advice to writers in this country writing in the English language who are maybe feeling a little out on a limb here in Israel?
Well, the first thing I would do is get rid of that mindset, of being out here, alone and stuff like that. You could be in Tijuana or somewhere, have the same. I think the first thing is not to see yourself isolated, and that gets back to the times we live in right now. I look at when I'm corresponding with many of my friends, they're all over. And so there really isn't any center like, we have to be in New York or something like that. I found Tel Aviv much more attractive than New York. Seriously, and it seems a little more hipper too. But what happens is that I think that's the first thing in terms of just how you view yourself. And then sometimes what happens is that you create the center. You say, okay, this is going to be the center of things. Okay, be like Ferlinghetti. All of a sudden, okay, here's City Light Bookstore, and everybody wants to come to it. Wherever you are, you can be here and say, okay, we're going to be known for this, and people are going to come here, and that's what I think is my real concern with Washington, D.C. I've been in D.C. For so many years, and we don't see ourselves as being a cultural capital where many cities are political and cultural capital. We'll be in D.C. at a meeting and looking at what's going to happen in Boston. And I said, well, wait a minute, we're the White House is down the street, NPR is here, we should be the cultural capital, okay? See, I have this J.K. Polk approach to life, you manifest destiny, we're going to be we're going to go claim the rest of it. I can put that on every now and then. And I think that's how you have to see yourself here. You have to say, okay, we've got great writers. You're honoring people who are retiring. Are you retiring yet? Right? We're honoring people. All of a sudden, what happens? You have to realize, okay, you have all these jewels here, okay? And you have to celebrate yourself. See, this is another thing. Not only is president promotion. Promotion. You have to promote yourself as if somebody's in Milwaukee, they want to come here right now. That's how you do. Or like, for example, your journal. 5 to 6 issues. Maybe you've got one of the best journals in the region. Because the key thing with many of these things is sustaining them. Sustaining them. See, that's the key thing. But don't feel that somebody is doing something much hipper somewhere else. Okay? If you've got the talent and genius right here, this is going to be like Black Mountain 2. I tell people there's always a sequel to something except Catwoman, but that's another issue. But what happens, see yourself here and give yourself credit and say, okay, you're making history. You're changing the literary landscape. That's how you have to see it. Okay? Don't see yourself as being margin. And that's coming from a black man.
This is the amount of time that we've allotted for this. I'm sure if you have more questions, you can, I'm sure that Joy and Ethelbert will be happy to take them after. But stay until 6 o'clock and you'll hear them read some of their own work. Okay? I'm sorry, until what time?
6:30.
They're starting, no.
Less long
Does it say 6:30 or?
Yes, 6:30.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that is kind of,
It's a
but
long break. Can we shorten the break?